Hello everybody, it's great to be back. This is the Global History Laboratory Study Circle, and today we are going to discuss a rather old paper by Professor Toyin Falola, Writing and Teaching National History in Africa in an Era of Global History, which was published in the journal Africa Spectrum in 2005. And I picked this article because Toyin Falola makes some very important remarks on the kind of challenges or actually critiques of being too blind, of conducting, striving for a kind of total global historian approach to the past. Falola is one of the most well-known African historians doing research on the African past, but also on the African contemporary era. He has been based in the United States for a long time. His contribution to the discussion about what global history could be, should be, and should not be in terms of when you focus on African history and the history and doing history on the African past is a very important contribution to our discussion. Today, apart from myself, Holger Weiss, we have discussing Falola's text Patrik.
Hi.
And Martins.
Hi.
And let us start with his introducing remarks, because he is very quick in opening the discussion by putting his critique. And we have to remember this text was written in 2005 in an era where the kind of this idea of the disappearing of the nation state was still very powerful around. We had historians both in North America and in Europe and other places, and also political scientists especially arguing that the nation state is going to disappear. And of course this discussion has been going on, and there's a kind of realization, especially after 2008 and the economic global crisis, that the nation state has not disappeared at all. So this one has to remember about that Falola's text is written before this kind of the reappearance, so to say, of the nation state. But his critique is kind of put already in the first page on the table, when he writes that for powerful countries, the agenda of global history is actually to retain their dominance, to build prestige around their location as the centers of the world, and to construct patriotism in such a way that their citizens see the advantage of birth and mentorship in a nation, such that migrants can be attacked and expelled when necessary. And I think this sentence already is a reminder that one should not be too blind about, when we speak about global history, that global history, and especially the approach of global history, can be used also not to include the so-called the others, but to kind of exclude the so-called the others. And this, of course, is a fundamental critique, and this one really has to kind of integrate into our discussion. I think it is also important when he, in the next sentence, declares that it is the weak nations that are being asked to adjust, to subordinate their national histories to the threatening agenda of a global world and a global history. And I think he makes two very clear and powerful points about that. There is, and especially when he was writing from looking at what was going on in the historiography of both national and global history in the year 2004-2005, that there is a kind of hidden agenda as he saw it, which he was attacking and criticizing. And now I leave the floor open to what do you think, Patrik and Martins, about this opening?
Yes, thank you. It was a really powerful approach to the critique of global history, and it's the issues I've actually been thinking about for a long time, ever since I came into contact with research in global history, which bothers for me initially on the perspective of how to conceptualize global history, inclusion versus exclusion. Because in from that perspective, both inclusion or exclusion can actually still be seen as global history. But Falola I find it very interesting that Falola comes through the perspective of an agenda of a global history and globalization. So I think the intelligence here might have to be thinking through the difference. And as global historians, how do we segment global history from globalization? Do they have to be both intertwined, or can they really be, in this respect, differentiated, so to speak, as two different concepts that can be expanded upon? So I think that's where, for me, one aspect of this critique really strikes me exceptionally. And also, secondly, towards this conceptualization of the weak nations being made to subordinate their national histories. And when I think about the intentionality of what the nation state erupted at the time of its inception, I see sort of the nation state being this segment of, so to speak, the so-called globalization, which tends to be identified here as the kind of like the sine qua non which global history must battle. So for global history in a sense inculcates nation states. So how then do we differentiate the histories of these nations within this global context in globalization, so to speak? And the aspect of the weak nations in a global picture then becomes something that really strikes me. And as global historians, I know these are things we will battle with for a long time to come through to clarify the concepts for global history really clearly, and probably really tend to listen more to perspective from the South, from these weak nations, in order to create a more sustainable perspective and approach for global history. But I'll stop here because we still have a lot of ideas to go through.
Yes, thank you. And I think it's a great read for us in the Global History Lab, that we can think about how far global history, or the theory of global history, has come in 15 years, and we can also think about where it was 15 years ago. And also, I think that this text, as it comes up to this in our group now as a subject of discussion, it's quite clear that we have been not struggling, but we've been working with these same questions and how to include the history narratives that play a part in, let's say, for instance, in the global South that we have been speaking about. How do we include the global South in the global North, or the global history's narrative? And I thought that there were many interesting points that Falola brings up that I agree with. Someone might initially see that, okay, this is a defense for national history. I think that in part it is, but in part it's a defense for the teaching of history, and how we should also pursue, as historians who are trying to educate younger historians, how we should try to pursue a new way of integrating this, as it was then, new phase of global history, and the old way of writing and teaching national history, or mostly history based in a national narrative. And I thought that he had really sober suggestions for us historians. I also think that one point he brings is that, well, he says that global history has become an instrument of some hidden imperialist agendas, but at the same time he is not saying that history as an instrument is the problem. He is more or less saying that, yeah, global history as an instrument, but what are the intentions? And the same goes with the discussion he has about national history. What are it is an instrument, of course. He explains it's been an instrument. It's been a very empowering instrument also. But what are the intentions today in this modern age, and how do we historians look at this kind of collaborations between different, not paradigms, but instead how incorporate the power of the knowledge that lies behind global history research, and that still, as he says, national history is not dead, that we still go back also to local history or regional history. So in the end, I think he has great suggestions, and actually I think that's in a way something that actually came to take shape in one way or another in the trend of global history, orientate in these quite difficult waters that he is describing. And of course, from an Africanist perspective, of course, there are a lot of histories that haven't been told. And I think that also tends to become a question of privilege, where global historians from the West or the global North had the privilege of having those histories written and told. And in a way, the confidence of stepping out of that zone and looking at the larger picture of global history as it was then. And at the same time, I can see that there's some kind of issue in Africa still today, that there are a lot of stories that haven't been written, haven't been told, haven't at all been put in any context. So I think that, and I think that he also, in a way, he targets that issue in this text.
I would be kind of make a plea of kind of taking Falola's critique much more serious, in a sense that my reading of Falola is that it's not merely about the question of how to include African or Southern experiences, or to, in a sense, not provincializing be it African or Asian or Latin American nation states in the kind of global story. I think he's much more saying that we should place, be it the African or the Asian or the Latin American nation states, in center, and see how global forces, the forces of globalization, have been affecting throughout history the developments of the local African communities, evolving into African colonial states, evolving into African post-colonial states, as the kind of shifting the emphasis from the global north to the global south. And of course, in his text, what he's saying is that he wants African historians to put the African nation states in center, and then kind of look both, if we speak on the kind of scalar, from a scalar perspective, both down to the local conditions, down to the local pasts, down to the regional pasts within these African nation states, and how these African nation states interact with other African nation states, but are also then affected by external, be it African forces, be it non-African forces, and then also the question about pre-modern, modern, hyper-modern forces of globalization, and how these have affected both African communities, African nation states, and how African communities, nation states, and African activists have been telling different stories about what is going on. And I think when I read this text some 15 years ago, kind of this realization, it took me 15 years to kind of realize what Falola really was saying, is that, and of course there have come out many more books on and powerful pleas on kind of putting the South in center. What comes into my mind is when we read the Komarov's theories from the South, which kind of makes a similar claim, much more powerful claim, because it is a book, it's much more lengthy and so on. But it kind of, if you combine Falola's and the Komarov's theory from the South, you have a very good kind of roadmap on a critique or how to kind of do history from this perspective. So it's more than including. It's, in a sense, for me, it is shifting.
Reversing?
Maybe not reversing, because then it would create a counterforce. It's for me, it's more kind of trying to, for me as non-black, non-African, to if I want to do research on the African past, what does it mean? Does it mean that I continue this kind of, let's say, white European pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial narrative, which is one narrative? Or can I, as non-African, be part of the development of a, be it counter-narrative, be it a narrative which puts the center on the African experience and not the non-African experience? Because, of course, it's much easier for me to work with what is called the colonial archive, which we also could extend to be the pre-colonial or early modern non-African archive on Africa, which is different to the oral archive of local experiences, which is, of course, much more difficult to dig out if you're not part of that society.
True.
But it's, in a sense, that's, of course, we could say that's the task of African local historians, to bring out these stories and the experience and so on. And then we should meet somewhere in the middle ground and see what is going to happen. And this, of course, is going on. This is kind of not that now I have invented some kind of new approach. I mean, this is, of course, old stuff. This is what we have been trying to do. But we have always to remind ourselves that where are we positioning ourselves?
Also, I think it's really interesting to see, in the light of the critique for global history, what I see is global history in a way bringing some sort of a solution to this dichotomy between how to find this balance from the dominant hegemonic Western narratives of the pre-colonial or early historical narratives from the South, and probably the oral histories or the stories from those regions. Because rather than thinking through the light of what a counter-narrative is, I think global history then comes to that perspective where it opens up the space for the other voices, for the narratives from the really local perspectives to engage in and probably developing what really the global history should really be. So instead of thinking through that perspective of the counter-narrative, I see it more like an opening up, so to speak. Opening up from the perspective of, like in Ghana, the Osu stool, for example, the chief, the emergence of the differences between the pre-colonial and the post-colonial state and all that. I see that as a way which global history can actually introduce this balance to the narrative, and then probably see from Falola's perspective the strength, which not globalization as in this instance, but global history can present to history as an instrument for education. And I remember at some point in his in this article, he speaks about what is the relevance of the historian, what is the relevance of history in development, especially from the global South, especially historians in the global South thinking, well, when I study history, I also had this struggle when I was still in Nigeria studying. And it was like, in history, what are my chances of contributing to society as a historian, you see? But now from the perspective of global history, I see that global history can bring forth a richer understanding of the evolution of the historical narratives of these societies, and actually try to help, students especially understand how development has shifted over time, and probably help to even get to understand if the inclusion of probably past developmental strategies can actually aid the evolution of the global village in globalization today. So I see this rather than probably in the sense of being an agenda. The agenda could actually become a strength in a way, not necessarily an agenda per se, but global history as a sense being a strength for the globalization perspective to development, and how to see if we can juxtapose past developmental concepts through the narratives using history as an instrument, and then in recent times trying to use that. So I see this, I see in a way global history, if we tend to really take the critiques really critically from the perspective of Falola, I see more strength in the use of more of these national historical narratives and trying to go down to the local as a way to open up global history and then expand the intelligence which we as historians actually provide for the world and the academia in general. Yeah.
Yes, so far I agree with both of your remarks, and I can see the attraction of making the comparison between early global history's attempts to unify or create some kind of like a great narrative for a unified global world. And I can see how you would make a comparison to the imperialist colonial way of conducting and offering this as like as you were saying, also like offering global history as a solution, but with the hidden agenda of actually subordinating the spaces in the margin or provincializing. And in a way, I can see how you make the comparison to those historians and in those nations that are trying to configure how do we place in the history of the world, how does this nation place among other nations in Africa or in the whole world. And I can understand that, okay, global history might have been perceived as something that will erase our attempt to gaining a voice in this world, and he's asking where's the African voice going to be located. And I think that what you were saying, and Holger also, that we can also create through global history, it can create the space and space for voices that haven't been heard, and that can be elevated also to the, I mean, I don't like to use the relevance word, but the relevance of our global history. And local history is absolutely relevant to global history. And we have talked about this a lot, because what we are conducting is usually a spatial turn, in a way that we are trying to place new centers, trying to imagine new centers of global history. As Holger was saying, Africa could, in Falola's description, become this new center. Should. And we've done these kind of experiments where we actually place a focus on Africa on some point in time, and we can extrapolate a small or a grand history and narrative from those places. So this is absolutely something that can be done and has been done. And I think that in a way it's interesting how he describes his attempts to develop national history into becoming this engaging, including, in a way, for Africa, probably revolutionary instrument for getting your voice heard. But you could perhaps even change the national history that he's using to what we describe as global history in our lab, and we could discuss the same thing, that he thinks that national history can open up, and we absolutely think that could be also done in this concept of global history as we understand it.
I think I just want to kind of continue yours and Martin's discussion about recentering. In a sense, recentering the starting point from telling the story about the global experience, so to say. And what Falola is reminding us and kind of making a very strong plea, as you already have pointed out, is that Africa and Africans have always been and are part of that global experience. And this is, of course, a very powerful reminder, in the sense that if the kind of idea of globalization, and from Falola, which I kind of would say, that I would make the same kind of argument, that we have a long story of globalization as a, if you so want, northern project which kind of links up with the question of colonialism, imperialism, extractive capitalism, and so on. And that story kind of puts Africans and also Asians and Latin Americans in the periphery, or even kind of as non-existing parties in that global experience, because the story is told from the north. What Falola is saying is that Africa and Africans are part of this experience. And he takes the example of the transatlantic slave trade, he takes examples of other kind of situations in the past. And what this means, of course, for us historians and for us global historians is that, and what Falola also says in his text, is that these African voices and these African positions, as you have already underlined, have to be integrated, both in the syllabuses and the teachings at African universities in the African states, but also as much, I would argue, in the global north, where it's very easy to kind of present a kind of overview of the global past, which pretty much looks like the old kind of wine in new bottles. So what he says is that, no, we have to, when we speak about 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century experiences on imperialism, colonialism, the African slave trade, the colonial period, the post-colonial period, we have to integrate and we have to lift up also the African voices, the African kind of visions about the past, about the present, about the futures, the African positions on and voices and visions on what is development, not from a Western perspective, but from an African perspective. What kind of development have these, usually we could define them as thinkers, as spearheads, as intellectuals, as activists, be they political, be they whatever, but also local people, local voices. And this is much more difficult to grapple because the intellectuals would publish, like Senghor, like Nkrumah, like all the others that are mentioned by Falola in his texts. But what kind of development did they see? Not the development of the World Bank, not the development of the structural adjustment programs, not the development of the IMF and so on, but what are the kind of African positions which have to be kind of put into the global experience of the past, present, and future? What are the African local national visions for the future? It's much easier to kind of have an external perspective, even today in 2019, from an EU perspective where you kind of focus on Africa. But this is kind of pretty much as we always have been done, looking from the global north to the global south and telling to the global south what to do. What Falola is saying is that now we have to kind of reverse that perspective if we want to do global history seriously.
Yes, and I think it's also really interesting to because what I hear you say, Holger, is to see global history from a perspective of a developmental framework, which is one scale to which global history could approach intelligence on the narrative from the South. And it's really interesting because prior to the entire colonial project and all that, there actually could be some solution, so to speak, which we grapple about, especially when he writes here about the failures of the structural adjustment programs, which is something I'm actually studying at the moment. But it's also interesting to see from that perspective, especially through a developmental framework, what really could work. In other words, bringing more strength to what globalization really could be. And in my head, I'm hearing what the future of globalization could be, in a sense, And so it's really interesting to look at that from that perspective, especially from the developmental perspective, and to think through how globalization affects this global history. But at the same time, sometimes I think about, especially where I write here from his text, it almost feels like global history feels like a concept that tends to colonize history. In other words, it's difficult for me to actually distinguish and find that meeting point or the middle point between global history as a concept and then history in a sense, so to speak. And so we have to, I think, in our course to developing our own perspective on global history, we have to get to that narrative, to that point where we expand on that. And then I also wrote here global history as a history of resistance. But then when I think about it as well, a history of resistance. Resistance to what? It's kind of like this whole collective mindset of what we tend to try to understand as resistance, so to speak. Resistance to a project, resistance to a narrative, resistance. What are we really resisting? So to speak. In other words, it opens up the window to make global history a lot more richer. The narrative, especially, making history a much more richer discipline, bringing more strength, more emphasis on what history really should be, rather than just narratives, but actually impacting our understandings, especially like Holger, you mentioned, on past visions of the future, and how the past visions of the future are still included or probably still influencing most of the conflicts we still have today in the present, especially when I think through a recent concept I was reading about, which was called repeat conflicts. So there are these conflicts all over the South, especially in Africa, where the conflicts tend to repeat. And so these are problems that have been grappled by the United Nations and peace and conflict researchers, and how to go about these conflicts that tend to repeat themselves all the time. And so global history from this perspective can bring a solution through seeing through the repeat conflicts as past visions of the future struggling for the same hegemony of what it is that the present really encapsulates, so to speak. So global history from Falola's perspective here might be seen, yes, as a critique, but I also see it providing more strength towards finding solutions to what globalization is grappling with today in the present, and how relevant the historian of the 21st century and beyond can actually be from this perspective, especially through the larger narrative of the entire global story.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent analysis of Falola's text. Also, that in a way I see that he engages in this question as an activist in a way, and we could see also historians as agents of resistance or as activists, especially if we feel that the area of our interest is being erased or being narrowed down into something quite insignificant. And I think that also, as he writes, that if global history is going to place us in the margin, in the province, then resistance will start to develop from within this province, and in a way that we will prove to you that the history of Africa is actually much more than a marginalized side story of something greater and grander. I also thought that what Holger was saying about the lived experiences and how Africans would have understood themselves, their voice, their place, if they understood. And of course I argue that those narratives haven't been told in the same scope and then in the North. Still in the global North, there are several stories, of course, that haven't also been told because there is a hegemonic understanding of what the history's narrative is at certain times. But I think that there's a good point in Falola's text where he says also that we could see in Africa examples of people that navigate between these kind of solid blocks of concepts that the maybe global history had established, kind of these blocks of, let's say, the democratic bloc, the communist bloc, and the Western, the East, and so on, but that we have evidence of these African examples navigating between these combining capitalism with communism and all kinds of different ways of organizing, and which also tell a very important thing about survival and existence and facing the difficult odds that they had. And I mean, you also raised the great question of what could the future be for global history, or the future for African history and history in general. And at the same time, I was thinking about this, that Falola mentions already in 2005, the threat of brain drain and the drain of knowledge that Africa was experiencing, and that Africa is still experiencing today, which also may be part of this unbalanced narrative that to pursue success and wealth, you have to go away, you have to travel over the sea. I mean, that's a powerful story, and it's still today very powerful. And I think at the same time, you have these kind of counter forces. For instance, in Ghana, this year, 2019, was coined as the year of return. So you also have a lot of American, in a way, returning to Ghana or to Africa, where their ancestors were forced to leave. And in a way, this kind of counter movement, what narrative does this fit in, and what is the prospect in the future for this becoming, and this has already become a great question, what does it mean to return? What do you do when you have returned? And how does the state answer? Do you locate new jobs? Or what is, like, a lot of questions that also has to do with trying to situate this moment in time in some kind of global explanation of what do we have at our hand now. And I mean, a lot of the, now I'm talking about returnees, so to speak, and a lot of them are in a way using history to justify the return. In a way, using history quite like a concrete solution to some kind of a problem. And this might be an existential problem, more or less, not a financial problem in that sense. But so history is being used, and great grand narratives are being those who are quite forcefully empowering these kind of decisions that people are making for their lives.
I make one concluding remark, because I want to open up a new discussion which we are not going to discuss, or a new topic that we're not going to discuss here in this session, but it's going to be a topic for new discussions. But Falola makes a very powerful and a very kind of interesting opening that we have to kind of think over the next time when we meet, is when he writes, and this is on page 505, but nationalist history in Africa has carried too far is not the kind of nationalism that produced racism or ethnocentrism in the West. And this is an interesting opening, important argument about that. Yes, we have also as global historians to look on nationalism and the nation state and look at the kind of differences of developments of these nation states and how they kind of have been looking at those within the state who are not part of the majority. So this kind of Western experience, especially the European experience, or the European core idea of the nation state, which one could say when it was developed in the late 18th or the 19th century with one language, one state, and so on. Of course, this few, if any state, is kind of one nation, one state. The jump or the development to a racial approach to members within that nation state, that's the experience of the West, of the global North, where the state is putting boundaries at who is a member, who is not a member, who is a citizen, who is not a citizen, and so on. And where we kind of have now been discussing on internal colonialism in, let's say, the Scandinavian and Nordic state and so on. So it's not only colonialism is about going out from Europe, it's also colonializing people within the national boundaries. We speak about the Sami people, we speak about the Roma people, we speak about minorities, be it religious minorities or ethnic minorities within, let's say, pre-modern, modern, and post-modern states. And here we have a possibility for when we put Africa and the African nation states in center to tell a different story. Because none or almost none of the post-colonial African nation states are nation states in that sense, as we would say, but the Western model of the nation state would like to see it. Almost all of the post-colonial African nation states are complex entities of multi-ethnic groups. And some of the groups, as we all know, you find them divided by colonial artificial boundaries and so on. But the experience, the lived experience of today's African nation states is that you have to kind of cope with this situation. The idea of one nation, one state, one language, one state is almost impossible in many of the African contemporary nation states. But we will end here. This will be an opening for new discussion about the African experience on the nation state.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.